and a very warm welcome to Yarning with Bee. I'm Beatrice, and on my channel I post podcasts semi-weekly. Every other time, so once a month, I talk about knitting, and every other time I talk about literature. And today is it's time for the latter, so this is episode 2 of Bee's Books. Last time I had a bit of a theme running with Jane Austen books. Today I am rather gonna do like a mini review of the 2 books I have finished since last time, being very aware that 2 books is not a whole lot, but one of them is Middlemarch by George Eliot, which I set out to finish, and I finished it last night. And it was pretty heavy going, so I'm still quite proud of myself, even if it's just the one book. I'm also going to share with you some new books that I purchased the other day. In Sweden, we have a huge national book sale once a year at the end of February, the beginning of March. And some of the books I ordered online and they have, of course, been delayed, so I don't have those to share with you, but I also bought some physically in the bookstore. So those ones I will present to you. I'm really excited about them. But first of all, last time I said that I was reading The Cossacks by Leo Tolstoy. And this one, of course, I finished over the month. It is a small read in this little cloth-bound edition. Only about 250 pages or so. And very approachable, especially for being Tolstoy. It was published for the first time in 1863, so it predates both War and Peace and Anna Karenina. It is about a young man who, in true Russian literature fashion, has about 10 different names that he's called by throughout the novel, but I'll call him Olenin because that's what he is mostly referred to. He is part of the upper echelons of Moscow society and decides to join the regiment as a low-ranking officer. I don't remember what the actual, what his actual title was. Yes, he joins as a cadet and is sent off to, with his regiment, is sent off to Cossack country, where he then takes up residence in a Cossack village and gets to know lots of people there. He falls in love with the culture, the nature, and so on. I will preface this by saying there will be spoilers for the Cossacks. There will also be spoilers for Middlemarch further on in the episode. Anyway, back to Olenin. He, like I said, he falls in love with this way of life and imagines himself staying there forever and giving up his giving up society in a way, at least the type of society that he is used to, that he's grown up with, and that he is familiar with, because he has this kind of dreamy, idealistic view of the Cossacks' way of life. And it ends with him having to, or choosing to, leave this place after all, because his ideas about the place are quite flawed. He realizes that he perhaps doesn't belong there in the way that he had thought. So that's in brief what happens. And we do get a lot of glimpses that don't include Olenin as well, that include members of this Cossack village. Yeroshka, or as he's called, Uncle Yeroshka, is one of the main characters. He's quite he's an older man and what we would call a drunk, and he believes himself to be what a real Cossack should be and keeps criticizing the younger generation. He is a hunter and he takes to Olenin, takes him under his wing, as it were, brings him out, teaches him to hunt, and shows him the beauty of the landscape and the nature around the village. Then there is Lukashka, or Luka, I'll call him that because it's easier to say. He is a young Cossack, up and coming. He's part of their military regiment, and he makes a name for himself quite early on in the novel by killing an abrek with whom the Cossacks have a very long and quite violent history of armed conflict. This is actually a really interesting point in general because I assume if one was reading this at the time it was released and also in the geographical location, like where this actually takes place, it might make a lot of sense and you kind of have the context already in place. But as a modern reader who is not at all familiar with Russian history or Cossack history or the history of that geographical area, the nature of the conflict is never explained in any way at all. It just seems to be taken for granted. Clearly there is a religious aspect to it. It's a Christian versus a Muslim people who clash, but the roots of the conflict are not explained in any way. And I think if I had knowledge of that, or indeed taken the time to learn about it, I might have understood some of the nuances of the story quite a lot better. But Luka, he kills an abrek, one of the enemies, quite early on in the novel, makes a name for himself, and is later on fatally shot by this man's brother. So that's his fate. Then there is the daughter in the house where Olenin rents a hut. He doesn't just rent a room, he rents his own hut. They have two huts. Her name is Mariana, and I do apologize about the pronunciations here. I'm doing my best. She is very interestingly portrayed in an almost incredibly idealistic way, which links very well into one of the themes that I found to be most intriguing in the book, which is the role of women, the role of marriage and of courting in general. Mariana is a hardworking young woman. She's certainly not idle, and she's always described as wearing a long shirt, just a shirt. I might have been able to Google that and see how that looked, but it's just a very, it's, considering this is written in the mid 1800s, it's, you know, not the perhaps usual garb that you meet in young women of the time. She is of a marriageable age. Her parents have been reluctant to marry her off. And she is, in the beginning of the novel, not really officially, but later in the novel, officially engaged to Luka. However, Olenin is, I want to say, obsessed with her. And for a very long time, he regards her from afar without daring to approach and speak to her. And later on, this develops into a sort of, they occupy the same space as he comes to visit her parents and speak, and she just sits crouched by the stove and watches him. And Olenin reads into this some kind of mutual understanding and romance. That's one thing that is very fascinating, I think, about the character of Mariana. She is, and perhaps this is a very much a cultural thing, because it's not only her who acts in this way, but several of the other people in the Cossack village, but it becomes the most apparent in her. She is very careful about what she says and how she answers, and often just remains silent, which makes her own thoughts and feelings completely mysterious to both the reader and to Olenin, who, as I said, kind of reads in a potential marriage match with Mariana, as he imagines himself to stay in the village. And when Luca is fatally injured, he comes to Mariana and asks her if she will indeed marry him, and she completely scoffs at him and is very, I want to say, insulted almost by the proposition, because while Olenin feels that he has integrated into the village and into their way of life, to them he has always been an outsider. And it's the same thing with Yaroshka, who he spent a lot of time with. And when he leaves, Yaroshka is all very, chummy, but as soon as he turns away, he has more or less forgotten about him, because having visitors from the Russian regiment is not new to these people. They come and go. So yeah, it's a very interesting idea of self-perception versus the perception of others, and idealization versus reality. So I just want to return briefly to this idea of courting and the role of women. Early on in the novel, Tolstoy writes that really only the women in this village actually work, and the men mostly hunt and or amuse themselves and sometimes go to fight the Chechens. At the same time, apparently the women are valued very highly, but they're expected to obey blindly. So there are a lot of very strong, I think, conflicts in the way that women are presented as being expected to behave and how they are actually behaving. Mariana and her young female friends, they're quite, they do work very hard during the day and they are part of the village life, but they're also quite free, especially in the way they choose to entertain themselves in the evenings with the officers and so on. There isn't very much, well, for some of them there is the suggestion of sexual promiscuity, which would of course have been presented in a very other way if the cultural and geographic setting was different. But that's a really interesting aspect, I think. And the same with Mariana, she kind of leads Luca on, takes it for granted that they're going to be married, but she's very careful with how she communicates with him, and a lot of things are left unsaid. And of course, this is a cultural aspect which Olenin can never integrate with, never be a part of, which is why he probably misses so much of the undertone and the context of his stay in this village. I also just want to briefly mention, one of the reasons that I love Tolstoy's writings, I've actually never read Anna Karenina, so that's a joy that I still have left in my life. But I have read and loved War and Peace. I actually took a university course on it even. It was the best course ever. And it's his language, his use of language. And in this novel, in the Cossacks, it mostly takes the form of nature and the description of nature and how we as humans feel and experience the world and ourselves while we are in nature, in the forest, by the river, A lot of this book is centered around the river, the name of which I can't remember. And it's a way that I think that's the way that both the characters and the setting comes alive the best. The plot of the book is one thing, but the descriptions and the almost philosophical aspects that emerge in the the scenes that take place in nature and deep in seclusion are very strong. There's an especially strong scene when Olenin has been he's been shown an opening in the forest by Yaroshka, where apparently there has been a stag who slept, and the day after Olenin comes back alone and lies down under the tree or the bush where the stag had slept, and lies down there himself for a nap to kind of become one with nature. And that's also a really significant image of how he thinks of himself throughout the novel, and how he hopes, the fate and destiny that he hopes for himself, and which he entirely gives up in the end, to presumably return to Moscow society, but we don't really get a description of that. Anyway, that's it for the Cossacks. That was quite long-winded, but I really enjoyed and loved this book. It's also an excellent entry point into Tolstoy if it feels a bit daunting to read one of his really thick and big works. You get a fantastic experience of his skill and the historical perspective in the Cossacks, with a relatively easy read. All right then, now let's move on to Middlemarch by George Eliot. In size as in content, worlds away from the Cossacks, even though this was written barely 10 years later, between 1871 and 1872. This is the edition I have. It's a huge, thick cloth bound where most of the cover print wears off as you read it, but you get a nice little tassel instead of a bookmark. In my edition, it's about 850 pages. In most editions, it's around 900 pages. The text is dense, and I will be honest, this was tough going. I enjoy 19th century literature a whole lot. It's my favorite literary era in so many different ways. But my oh my, did this feel like a chore sometimes. Anyway, I'll give some context first of all. George Eliot is the pen name of Mary Ann Evans. And as I said, the novel came out in between 1871 and 1872. The reason that it spans a whole year is that her, not husband, but the man that she lived with, who could not divorce his first wife, decided that it would be a good idea to release this in 8 installments because of the sheer volume of text. So that's what they did, and then it immediately came out in 4 volumes after that. I will give you a brief synopsis. The subtitle of the book is A Study of Provincial Life, and that is certainly what this is. Middlemarch is the name of the town, the kind of growing industrial town in which the book is set, and there is a very, very large cast of characters. And that was probably one of the things that made the book a little bit more readable, because 900 pages about just like 1 or 2 people would be, I mean, unless they were exceptionally interesting people, that might have been even more heavy going, especially in the style that this is written. But the character gallery is enormous. The 2 main characters are named Dorothea Brooke and Dr. Tertius Lydgate. They're only peripherally connected their lives become slightly more intertwined towards the end of the novel. But initially, when George Eliot started writing this, it was two different pieces of work. So it was one book about Middlemarch, where Dr. Lydgate was the main character, and then she started writing a more gentrified novel where Miss Brooke, Dorothea Brooke, was the main character, and then she decided to merge these into two very good results, as many people have considered. So the fates of these two people is that Dorothea Brooke, she is 19 when the novel starts. She is ardent, is the word that Eliot uses for most of the novel. She's highly religious. She wants to live her life to a higher purpose, and in her youthful ignorance, really is the right word, she chooses to do so by marrying the 45-year-old Mr. Casaubon, who is a scholar and a clergyman, and he is rich and fantastically boring and very, very selfish. So that's what she does. The context around her is that she and her sister Celia are orphaned, but they live with their wealthy uncle, Mr. Brooke. So money is never an object in their lives, and they live a little bit outside of the town Middlemarch. Dr. Tertius Lydgate, then, he's a newcomer to Middlemarch. He has also got rather high and unusual aspirations in his life. He wants to, he's educated in Paris, and he wants to apply new techniques to the medical art or to doctoring and improve the lives of people. So he comes there to also be a part of founding a new fever hospital, and he is very career focused, but quickly falls in love with the daughter of one of the merchant families in the town, Miss Rosamond Vincy, who is very... Look, she's not portrayed in a positive way. She's vain and ignorant and selfish and incredibly immature, and doesn't really develop throughout the book. Of course, she is a product of her upbringing, but there you have it. So they marry, and they have a very unhappy marriage, as Dr. Lydgate then falls into debt to try to satisfy his new wife's penchant for spending, which she has from childhood. For Dorothea Brooke, it goes, I don't want to say better, but her husband, her horrible husband, passes away after about 18 months, I think, and she then has to grapple with the fate and purpose of her existence as a young widow. I think that's a really interesting theme in the book, the role of women. I mean, it's not exactly a secret that is one of the main themes, but that touched me the most because it's despite it being nearly 200 years later, I think that's a question that many young people grapple with today. Today perhaps is less isolated to women, that they don't know what they're supposed to do with their lives, and they only, because many of the women in this book, they do find their purpose by just existing for their husbands and kind of merging in the lives of their husbands. That really seems to be the message that Eliot wants to get across as well, which I think is slightly problematic and also very contradictory, considering the rather complex existential questions that Dorothea grapples with about how she can, for example, put her wealth to use, and her, despite not being formally educated, how she can still put her knowledge and her imagination and energy to use for society and for other people. And that contradictoriness is also something that I think Eliot partly picks up on. So from that perspective, I did enjoy the plot and the complexity of the plot. And really the complexity is what makes the novel what it is, and the large character gallery also what it is. I have in front of me here a list of many of the main characters, and I realize now that I probably won't go into them because that doesn't help anyone who hasn't read the book. But what I really just want to illustrate with that is the fact that many of them are complex. None of them really are morally perfect. Dorothea perhaps closely so, but in her ardent nature, she also exhibits a great deal of immaturity and to some extent also egotism, even though that is the exact opposite of her intention, which is also a very, very human and relatable trait, I think. So the idealism of the two main characters, Lydgate and Dorothea, is juxtaposed cleverly. They come from incredibly different backgrounds, and they also have a very different goal with their idealistic purposes, but they have the same type of energy. The difference being that Lydgate eventually has to conform to focusing on earning money to satisfy his marriage and make that work. So he leaves his scientific aims and prospects behind. Dorothea remarries a man whom her first husband economically supported in his youth, and then in his will said that Dorothea would have to give up her inheritance of the estate if she remarried this man. Dorothea had a certain amount of independent wealth and decides to marry this man instead. And the only thing we find out is that he continues on the path of politics, which is introduced to him earlier in the novel, and that Dorothea then supports him ardently in this. So there we are. The political landscape, which forms well, for me, it forms a backdrop throughout the novel. I assume that, again, a reader, a contemporary reader familiar with the political landscape of the late 1820s, early 1830s, when the novel is set, would perhaps see it as the foreground rather than the backdrop. But this is British politics around 1830 is completely unknown territory to me. So for me, the passages about that were long, confusing, and didn't really provide anything that contributed to my understanding of the novel, except the fact that there is a reform bill. Some are for it, some are against it, which is pretty basic, and there is a lot of nuance in here that I am obviously missing. So, yeah, I understand that those those types of contents are probably what makes this book a masterpiece for people in the know, but it was also partly what made it very difficult going for me. And like I said, I'm no stranger to 19th century British literature, but the explanations and the kind of convoluted language that's occasionally used, yeah, it was not always enjoyable. Sometimes it was very enjoyable because turns of phrase, metaphors, and a certain dose of humor, excellent sections, and those difficult parts are really mixed up with sections that are really easy to read more quickly. But there were lots of sections I had to reread several times, and that's not really conducive to a pleasurable experience of reading 900 pages. You know, there's a difference between reading 5 difficult pages and reading 900 difficult pages. So, wow, there we are. Gossip and scandal is an element in the book as well. One of the larger characters is called Mr. Bulstrode. He is a banker and he is evangelical, extremely religious, and believes himself to be better than everyone else. And it turns out that he has a very scandalous past, which also gets entangled with the fate of Mr. Lydgate later on. Dr. Lydgate, sorry, later on in the novel. So those passages are, when I say that there are easier passages, those passages are mainly village gossip or town gossip. And that's a really fun aspect of the novel, I think, when it mixes up really serious, because the beginning of each chapter has like a little quote and then usually some kind of philosophical little introduction. And then that can get mixed up with the rest of the chapter just being ladies chatting over tea and being catty about people who are not there. Oh, and another point that I want to bring up is also, this is it's a serious novel. It really is a serious novel, despite these little hints of humor every now and then. Perhaps, actually, maybe you disagree with me. Maybe if you've read Middlemarch, I would be so glad to hear what you think, because I think I need some more knowledge and context on it to appreciate it fully. But what I wanted to bring up was that when Dorothea finally gets together with her new beau, Will Ladislaw, this happens during a thunderstorm. The thunderstorm breaks out just as they are making their final confessions of love, and then they kiss as there is lightning and thunder outside the window. And I found it so utterly comical, having read through like 800 pages of really pretty heavy, serious stuff, and cholera and people going into debt and having gambling problems and so on. And then there is this really romantic type of bizarre coming together of star-crossed lovers in the middle of a storm that is more reminiscent of light-hearted romance novels. I mean, I assume it's intentional, and it was a really funny break, but it felt kind of mismatched with the rest of the contents of the novel. So, to finish off my little commentary, I want to just comment briefly on Virginia Woolf's quote again, which I, of course, misquoted last time because I didn't have it in front of me, but I wrote it down this time. Virginia Woolf said of Middlemarch, "It's one of few English novels written for grown-up people." Do I agree? I'm not even really sure what that means, to be honest. I tried to see what other people thought it meant, and opinions seemed to differ a little bit. I mean, yeah, I guess it's written for grown-up people. I think there are lots of novels written for grown-up people. I don't really have anything clever to say, except I'm not sure that this novel was worth the effort. I'm happy I read it because I had it in my bookcase. I set out to read it and I was curious to see what it was about. Would I recommend everyone else to read this? Probably not, unless they had a very specific interest in the author, the time period, the historical time period. I mean, if that's something that you really have a keen interest in that part of the world, yeah, this is probably a great description of that in many ways. But unless you have that type of interest, I don't think it's a must read. The prose is certainly admirable and very good, but is it 900 pages worth? Again, not so sure. And please disagree with me if you do disagree. That's it for Middlemarch. Now I'm going to share with you, rather briefly, a few things that I am really keen to read whenever I get around to it, which one never knows. like I said, the National Book Sale. And I think that's a really great place to find new and unexpected authorships. Of course, it's the Swedish publishers that come together and have this sale. So the books that I have bought are in Swedish, but they're all by international authors in this case, and they are all available in English. So I feel like the translation here is less important. The first one that I'm really excited about is by, and do pardon my pronunciation, the Dutch author Cees Nooteboom. A very ominous cover. This is just called Travel, 3 novels, but I looked up the novels that are in there, and in English translation, they are called Philip and the Others from 1954, All Souls Day from 2001, and Lost Paradise from 2007. Cees Nooteboom has been kind of in the buzz for the Nobel Prize several times, and he is a completely new acquaintance of mine. So I'm super excited to read his novels. My experience with Dutch literature is very limited. I read The Evenings by Gerard Reve last year around this time, and it was the singularly most depressing novel I have ever read in my entire life. And I feel like I really need to give Dutch authors another chance here. So that will be fun. The second book that I want to share with you is this one by the Catalan author Mercè Rodoreda. Maybe that's something like that she's pronounced, I don't know. And this in English translation is called Death in Spring. It's from 1986. Catalan literature I have never encountered or experienced before. So that will be a really, really special experience, I think, especially as reading the back of this novel. It's about a nameless people who believe that they need to protect their place of residence with these very strange and sometimes rather violent rituals. It sounds like it might have aspects of magical realism, but I'm not sure. It just sounds very unique in its plot and its approach, and of course I am super curious about the prose. So that will also be fun. And the final one by French author Genet, Funeral Rites in English, this one is called. It was written in 1947 and published in 1953, and it's set at the end of World War II. Genet is a new authorship for me as well, and when I googled him last night, I found out that he was incredibly prolific, but wrote fairly few novels. He also wrote drama and a lot of essays. So yeah, that will also be a new experience for me. If you have read any of these novels or have any relationship with these authors, I would be super curious to know what you have to say. Any type of context or opinion would be really fun to hear. And that's it from me today. I can reveal that I also bought a book about knitting socks, but that will have to wait until next time when episode 3 of Bees Knits is released. So for now, happy reading. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you